in the fall, and we have 4 lectures per semester, 1 per month roughly. The last one will be at the end of this month that I'll mention here in a minute. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Scott Newbold. I'm a member of the biology faculty here at the college, and we have been lucky enough to run this lecture series for 25 plus years with folks who started before me. And it's a neat way to learn about some scientists that are here locally, to learn about some of the scientists that are in the region and even across the country. And so lucky tonight to have a local native, but he's done some work across the world. So we'll hear about some of his work here in a moment. The last lecture, just to put this on your radar, last day of April 30th, Patrick Lebrecq is the Director of Intellectual Property at GLD Partners out of LA, lives here locally, and the title of his lecture is Intellectual Property in Biomedical Sciences, an Overview of the Patent Process. So that's coming up in about 3 weeks. So tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Lawrence Todd, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Colorado State University and an adjunct professor at University of Wyoming. He's a Meeteetse native. Larry has taught anthropology and archaeology at Denver University, Boston University, the University of Wyoming, Colorado State, and Northwest College. He has been conducting professional archaeological fieldwork in Wyoming since 1975. Much of his career has focused on excavating and analyzing bison bone beds with a particular emphasis on taphonomy. I did have to look that up. Study of how organisms...
That's how you tell whether you've got a good dictionary or
Study of how organisms decay and become fossilized or preserved in the paleontological record, which I'm sure we'll hear some more about. Since retiring from Colorado State in 2009, returning to Meeteetse, Larry has divided his time between researching early human paleoecology in Northwest Ethiopia and investigating prehistoric montane and alpine land use in Northwest Wyoming. With the Ethiopian project now concluded, his work has focused on collaborating with students to further explore the archaeology of the Absaroka Mountains. So with that, please welcome Larry for the talk tonight.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you for inviting me here. Sort of a fun thing to do. I've got to warn you, I talk so much at dinner, my voice is a little off, but we'll make it through this. So tonight I want to talk mostly about archaeology, but I want to spend quite a bit of time talking about what archaeology isn't. Being an archaeologist, we often had people at meetings or wherever you are at a cocktail party tell you how much they like archaeology and how much they always want to be in archaeology and what about those dinosaurs. And so I like dinosaurs. As a matter of fact, in the taphonomy that Scott talked about, as part of my doctoral dissertation, I did study dinosaurs because I wanted to understand, in looking at bone beds where we have bison that could be a kill site, I wanted a control case of a bone bed where you wouldn't assume there was any human intervention in creating the patterns in it. So dinosaur bone beds are a great control case for studying human things that might be kill sites. So archaeology is not dinosaurs. The next thing that people say when they talk about archaeology is they want to talk artifacts. And for me, artifacts are real tangential to archaeology. Archaeology is about the question and the people. And the artifacts are just the traces of that from which you want to describe the people that were there in the past. And in terms of what I'm talking about tonight, and working in the mountains of northwestern Wyoming, an important concept is the concept of wilderness. You know, I'm a big advocate of wilderness areas, but if you read the Wilderness Act, it says where man was only a visitor. And it doesn't take you much long too long doing archaeology in the wilderness to realize what BS that is. The areas today that we think of as being wilderness, as being unpopulated, is because the people that lived there were extirpated and moved out. But for the last 10,000 years, areas that we call wilderness today were very heavily populated. And the probably keystone species, you hear about keystone species and they'll talk about grizzly bears or wolves or this or that or the other. The keystone species in wilderness was probably humans as being the major predator and the major dealing with things. So part of what we talk about is the concept of wilderness is based on some things that don't really work. And then I want to start talking a little bit about archaeological sites. And again, when people say archaeology, they say sites. And I become more and more convinced that the whole concept of sites is just worthless. We don't really need to deal with sites. And from there, we'll talk about what a surface record, and we'll talk a little bit about excavation landscapes and artifact locations and research and management and taphonomy a little bit and collections and maybe some data and some migrations and methods and observations and some puzzles and scale and methodology and interpretations. Depending upon which way my mind wanders throughout this. In slide 2 of presentations, you're normally supposed to have the outline of what you're going to do. So being a creative person, when I got into my motel room tonight, I thought this second slide is terrible. Let's ask AI to take this image and turn it into an outline. So this is what ChatGPT said. And so here's what my talk is really going to be about. It was done by artificial intelligence rather than sort of adult intelligence. So we're not going to do this part. Archaeology, or any sort of research, is the way I like to envision it, think about it, is it's a puzzle. We're trying to assemble pieces of this puzzle, and in archaeologies, to understand human behaviors and understand the past. One of the problems of the archaeological record is that a lot of those pieces disappear from the puzzle. So we're trying to understand this complex puzzle that has pieces that are not there, pieces that are gone away, or being taken away, all sorts of things like that. But in studying this, we have a whole series of research questions. And this is what we do when we're thinking about going to the field to do archaeology. So research questions, mobility, how did people move across the landscape? We might want to know something like that. Technology, how did human groups use things outside their biology to interact with the world around them? How did they make the tools? Where did they get the source stone to it? How did they have, what was their diet? What's the preservation, spatial patterns of things, group organization, how they transport, how old is it? And what's the source of the raw material? And where's the water supplies? And how often they discard things? And how do they reuse things? What's the vegetation structure? What's the food storage? And how did they travel? So when we're in the field doing archaeology, we have a whole series of research questions that we're trying to put together to reconstruct this picture of what the past was like that doesn't necessarily involve just going out and finding sites and collecting artifacts. We're trying to reconstruct a much bigger part of the picture. And as Scott mentioned, my focus before I started doing this stuff was in bison bone bed taphonomy, where we spent a lot of time uncovering parts of dead animals in really complex piles and having a fairly in-depth recording strategy in it. I've, besides being sort of addled in my mental capabilities, I'm also fairly anal. If we're going to look at something, we're going to record it in extreme detail. And that's what you see going on here with bison bone beds. So that was my background of if you're going to do something, record the hell out of it. In the early 2000s, I'd been doing bison bone bed work for about a quarter of a century at that time. I started to think about maybe I'll do something else that isn't as data rich. I'm getting tired of all these huge databases and I'm tired of all the computer time, and I'd like to spend more time outside and not so much time in the lab. So in thinking about that, I thought about growing up in the Matisse area and going home. I grew up in Meeteetse. My dad grew up in Meeteetse. My grandparents are there. My great-great-grandparents in that area. It's home. And I grew up on a place called the Pitchfork Ranch that the summer grazing area was this grable allotment that's partially in the forest and partially in the wilderness area. And so thinking about moving away from bone beds and maybe going someplace else, I thought about going back home. Or as I say, I'd been for quite a while and got to know the area fairly well. Got to run around in the wilderness area naked earlier than most people did. And I thought it was time to start revisiting that area a little bit and trying to reconnect with that place I'd grown up in. And so in 2002, we took a group of students there after we'd been done at a field season at that Hudson Main bison bone bed that I showed you the slides of, just to get a feel for what it would be like to do archaeology in the Absarokas. And having grown up there, I thought I had a pretty good idea of it. The plan for that first season was to do a survey along a forest trail through the wilderness that went about 20 miles and record the archaeology along it. We made it a total of 2 miles and recorded 4,000 artifacts. And that wasn't what I expected, in part because growing up there, you know, I'd been chasing cows around, I'd been hunting, I'd been doing stuff, I'd seen occasional stuff. That density just didn't make any sense to me. And secondly, there was that perception of wilderness. When I talked to the forest archaeologists and forest staff about getting permits to go up there to do the archaeology this year, their sort of bottom line response was, oh, go knock yourself out. It's wilderness. There won't be anything there. So 2002 really took that sort of biased perception and threw that out the window. And we do largely catch and release archaeology. Most of what we find stays right where we find it. We don't bring it back in several reasons. One of the ways that, and this is a good thing to talk to students about, if we leave that material there, it's there for the students to come back to in 20 or 30 years and redocument and demonstrate why that Dr. Todd fellow was totally wrong. There'll be new methods, there'll be new approaches, there'll be key things we learn. So if we leave it there, the basic information is still intact in the proper context. We only collect things in a few cases if things need specialized analysis. For example, we can't tell the source of obsidian in the field. We have to do dispersive X-ray fluorescence on the material. The technology is shifting to where the portable XRF devices are getting good enough. We could use those in the field. We wouldn't have to collect it, so we could tell the source of it by the micro elements in it. But to bring it back and find out where the obsidian came from, we have to pick it up. Some things, for example, when we're doing the high elevation stuff where ice patches are melting and organic materials are melting out of them and coming out of the ice where they've been for hundreds or thousands of years, and all of a sudden out of the ice box into the oven, they start decaying real quickly. So those we sometimes bring. The third reason we collect artifacts in the area is if they're in high risk areas of theft. If they're in an area where people camp a lot, or if they're along trails, or if they're in those places where they can be taken away. Those we collect so we can take them to the University of Wyoming. They go into the repository there to where they're available for study in the future. So that last one is trying to avoid those pieces of the puzzle that are flying out of the forest. So working there, yeah, it's a tough place to work. I think, you know, in terms of impact, the one publication, and this is a photograph of my copy of this book by this article by Robert Foley called Offsite Archaeology, an Alternative Approach for the Short-Sighted, that he published in 1983. And I was in love with that. But in 1983, the possibility of doing what he talks about here just didn't really work. The technology wasn't there for recording surface scatters of artifacts, rather individual things. But somewhere here, when I was looking back at this slide, oh, this is a good thing. The archaeological record does not simply exist, but should be viewed as sets of phenomena available for experiment at all levels. And I really like that as a way to think about archaeology. We're out there trying to learn about the world on all sorts of different levels, and we're using all sorts of different data. And so what we do here is heavily influenced by this African archaeologist who published a paper in 1983 saying the archaeological record of global people should be viewed not as a system of structured sites, but as a pattern of continuous artifact distributions and densities. So rather than individual points on the landscape, Folio is arguing that you need to see every piece of thing across the landscape as bits and pieces of this puzzle. So we do something that's called Amber Weiss and the Grable River Sustainable Landscape Ecology Program is what we call our field work, in part because it's not just archaeology. We're trying to understand the whole ecology of the system of which humans are part. And also because it has the great acronym of GRIZZLY, which is a great name for a project to do in the Absaroka Mountains where there are actually grizzlies. So we've been working in the Absarokas. Sorry, I sort of got a sore throat. I was chewing a cough drop and I'm talking around a cough drop and we swallowed it. Since 2002, we've been working in the Absarokas in this kind of landscape scale approach that Foley talked about. And we focused in this area here. And between 2002 and 2024, we've recorded a little over 250,000 of surface artifacts in the area. 250,000 artifacts. That's that wilderness thing going on there. But in a little, there's some people in the room who have some experience there, and I didn't get all of them here because I didn't know they were all here. There's a Becky, and there's a Julie, and there's a Bill, and there's a Naomi that should have gotten a picture of. I didn't know she'd be here. So there's people that have been involved here for a lot of times, recording over 250,000 artifacts. I may have mentioned I'm a little anal. This recording here is how many this was that first year when we got 4,000 artifacts. We thought, isn't that an amazing amount? The next year, we got about 17,000 artifacts. Bad year that year in 2004, up and down and up and down. This is the cumulative number of artifacts by year we've been recording. Some you get post-fire years. And we'll talk about that a little bit. You get others, these are all the puzzle pieces. You get the retirement slump. I retired from teaching in 2009 and did that retirement. What do I do now? For about a year or so. And then I said, get your butt out of the chair and get back to doing what you love. I talked about when you meet people at parties who want to know about archaeology and they say either dinosaurs or artifacts. The next thing they often ask you is, what's the most exciting thing you've ever found? And this is the most exciting thing that I have ever found archaeologically. This is a data set from our 2001 data set. That each item out there, we said that over 250,000 artifacts, we've got 58 locational and descriptive attributes that we can record on each one. We do this in the field, we pick it up, we record it, we enter all the data, we put it back down. Pick up the next one, record it, put it back down. I tell students that are interested in doing archaeology, it's the most mind-numbingly tedious stuff you'll ever do in your life. A good day, a team of 2 people can record 500 to 700 artifacts like this. Those 58 locational and descriptive items theirs are over 250,000 artifacts, means that this data set has 15.3 million data cells in it. So we've created sort of an archaeological big data set for what we're doing here. So in 23 years of field work, I've documented artifacts in 3389 hectares. And I'm sorry, I'm metric. That's my grandpa's fault. When I was a little kid, grandpa used to say inches is for idiots. And I took that. That was a joke. That's what I say to my grandkid. I'm metrically deformed. So we've done about 8,000 acres in the Washakie Wilderness. That's 8,000 acres is a pretty decent area. But that's only 1.2% of it we've looked at. So again, that wilderness thing, if we've got that many artifacts in 1.2%, what's the whole landscape look like? And also, anything I say here tonight, and anything I say about this, remember, I'm looking at just a tiny picture of what's out there. So take it with a big grain of salt. I'd say what's going on in the Wasatch Wilderness, other than that there's a bunch of stuff there. We've looked at I originally, when I started this project in 2002, my goal was to do a 5% inventory of the wilderness. And I figured the last time I did the calculation, that'll only take another 95 years to get that done. No problem. Come back in 95 years and we'll talk about what we've learned. So puzzle pieces to do that. One of the key variables that we record is location. Today, the technology we have available to us, these GNSS receivers that you see people using here, can get us the location of an artifact within about 50 centimeters. And that's okay for the surface. When we're doing excavations, we like our artifact locations to be within about 5 millimeters of accuracy. So we do, even though coarse grain stuff, it's still what we do it. So we record the locations on everything. We record context on every object, whether it's in a grassland setting, whether it's in an eroded setting, whether it's in a rodent mound setting, whether it's in a trail, how it was that you could see it. We record the elevation, blah, 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 or we record lots of stuff. And again, those are parts of this pieces of the puzzle. For those of you in this area and probably more familiar with or maybe more familiar with the bighorns, the Absarokas, you've got these beautiful ancient mountains with the granite and the limestone and all that stuff. The Absarokas, being only about 50 million year old volcanic debris, are a very different landscape. It's more fragile. It's not as connected. There's a lot of landslides, slumps, flows, modifications. It's a really interesting landscape. And it has a lot of rough and rocky travels, which makes sometimes field work a little difficult. One way or another, getting into our field camps sometimes looks like this. Sometimes you have to backpack in, and I love this. This is what I use when I'm recruiting students for if you're expecting to come out to the mountains and have some fun camping in the mountains, imagine what she wants to say to you.
So our research focus is
At the landscape scale. Again, we're not trying to look at individual sites. We're trying to look at the whole landscape. Things differ across it. And on high elevation archaeology. So the goal of our project is to look at areas above 2,500 meters, which is 8,000 some feet. Because for humans, that's something that's called the hypoxia zone. Above 2,500 meters, we're not biologically adapted to be, and things kick into our systems. I just thought in doing archaeology back home in the mountains, it'd also be kind of fun to focus on these areas where humans, although we're there a lot, it's not the biologically best place for us to be. So we've tried to do archaeology at these high elevations. And again, histogram of how many artifacts we've recorded at different elevations, and we've got them up there a ways. But we focus higher up there. Sheridan, down here in the lowlands, 1,100 meters. I get oxygen poisoning. So then I try and get at least one slide or one image in each slide where you can have a picture and enjoy before I start talking. I thought I'd give you some overviews of the area. Just some kind of pixel size areas of what the landscape looks like. These are 500 meter by 500 meter, 25 hectare areas. That's about 60 some acres. With every artifact that was recorded there, map to show you that. So these are sort of the puzzles of what's going on. This one, this is there any way to move that?
Might be. I don't know if we can grab it and move.
The number of chipstones recorded here is, I don't know off the top of my head, I wrote it down. Mean elevation, well, we can go down here. You can figure the total, you can figure the total number of artifacts there by taking the 25 hectares, and there's 177 artifacts per hectare. So I did this on purpose, so there's a little mental exercise for the slides. So this is one area. Administrative clusters. I stopped calling what we record in the field sites, because what we record is the individual artifacts. But then to communicate with the Forest Service or with the State Historic Preservation, you have to turn those into sites, because that's the way they deal with things. And in Wyoming, an archaeological site is defined as 15 prehistoric site as 15 artifacts or more separated by less than 30 meters. So what I do you just take these clusters and you go into GIS and you buffer them 15 meters and the things that overlap. You put it in as being a site or an administrative clusters, we call them now. So 3 administrative clusters here, and you can kind of see them, areas where there's lots of stuff. Another one of those windows into it. This one has not quite as many artifacts. It's an elevation of a little over 3,000 meters or about 10,000 feet. 7 administrative clusters here. Again, just the idea that if you look at these landscapes, the little dots, there's lots of stuff up there. This one, lower elevation now, 27 meters, more artifacts. There's 209 per hectare in this one, 7 administrative clusters. This area, we're getting down to the lower elevations now, just 2,700 meters, 207 artifacts per hectare. You get the big clusters here. In this area, some of the reasons there's so many artifacts in these, and we'll talk about this in a minute. This one was recorded after a fire and burned 3 parts. So you can see sort of the burned trees up in this area here. And fires change visibility. They're one of the things that makes archaeology more visible through time. And then when we get down to sort of the lower range of our area, this is around 2,500 meters right at the hypoxia zone, 275 artifacts per hectare. A hectare, to put that into something that people, except people from the teaching, can't understand, think of a square football field. About 100 yards by 100 yards would be a hectare. And I say people from teaching, not because I'm denigrating us, because we don't have full-size football fields. We're small in-person teams. So one of the things I talked about, all the things that we research and how you have opportunities and you have changes. For the first 5 years we worked on this project, the first 5 years, I thought I was getting an understanding of it. I thought, yeah, I've been here 5 years. We've done a lot of survey. We can stop this survey ship and start excavating, get into doing real archaeology. And then a fire burned through our area and really changed it made me wake up to how little I actually knew about it as we started going into the areas after a fire. To give you an example of that, here's an area, this place burned in 2006. We got back and looked at it in 2007. Then we've been going back and monitoring some of these areas through time. And in this area here in particular, before the site, there were 0 artifacts there. It was nothing. It wasn't a cluster. It wasn't anything. It was just a sagebrush covered meadow. After the fire, the year after it, there were 483 artifacts visible. In 2020, when we went back, vegetation had recovered it up and there were 0 artifacts visible. You know, that I talked about a puzzle, but also if I go off on another analogy, it's like a book that opens and then closes. You have an opportunity, window opens, closes, whatever opens, closes you like. And you can see that on every one of the sites that we've investigated multiple times. Pre-fire on this one, there were a little under 400 artifacts. After the fire, 1,600 artifacts. Drop back down as it revegetates. So plugging the fires into your work is really interesting in what you can learn. It's not only density. Off on another tangent, I said I'd talk about migrations. Some of the really fun data that have been being generated in the Absarokas is from the wildlife people that have been doing the GPS coloring, movement of various ungulates. And their data on elk is probably, well, there's more elk data up there than anything else. So we've been playing a little bit with the elk migration corridor data and the archaeology, even though, and this is one of those really neat archaeology questions, there's almost no elk being consumed as food in any of the archaeological sites up there. Elk were there, they're making tools out of the elk bones, they're taking the teeth and doing things with it, the antlers are being carved into things. But in terms of the food resources we see in the site, we see mule deer, we see mountain sheep, and we see bison in the sites. We don't see elk. Big question, why we don't. But that doesn't mean we can't play some fun games with the migration corridors. And on here, you see the migration corridors are the lines, the squiggles, the spaghetti across there. And some of the areas we've looked at, we wanted to partition some looking at the area into an area where there's lots of the migration corridors through it. And then a couple of years ago, I took the team into an area where there are no migration corridors. And also the other thing it didn't have, this area here has several Forest Service trails that go through it. It's accessible and traversed by multiple sorts of species and ways. Over here, there's a Forest Service trail that goes in, but can't go out of it. So I thought it'd be fun to ask a question of what's the difference between a highly migration used corridor and these things we call orphan drainages. Again, not so much with the feeling being that because elk are using this migration corridor, people were following the elk and hunting the elk, but the elk may be damn good indicators of the best way to get from point A to point B across the mountains. And that any other species that's going to be wanting to get from the Bighorn Basin to Yellowstone Park may be using pretty much the same corridor. That the elk migration corridors might be like the interstate highways of the past. And then you've got the highways, the county highways that will go up here. So we thought, wouldn't it be fun, or I thought it would be fun, to look at the differences in the archaeology we find here versus the archaeology we find there. And sorry, being the anal sort, I have to have tables. And the relative thing about this table is in the migration corridor place, the most common stone from which tools and the debris is found, obsidian. Obsidian comes from Yellowstone, not from here. Chert, no chert here in these volcanoes. Phosphoria chert from the Bighorns here itself along the migration corridors. Quartzite, no quartzite up there. And Morrison quartzite, specialized, you find those with statistically significant abundances in the corridor. Outside the corridor, those materials that come from elsewhere, the exotics, the things like that, are all statistically underrepresented. And what's statistically represented are the locally available, the chalcedonies from the area, the petrified wood in the area. They're using the local materials there. So again, I think this, to me, the model or the hypothesis this generates is that we can use the migration corridors of these species to maybe see how people are using the landscape. And we see differences in the assemblages around. Along the corridors, well, there's difference in types of tools and protective points, blah, 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 blah. We're not going to go into that. The obsidian, I mentioned that's a non-local material. We get obsidian in the Absarokas from a variety of places. And what you see here is, about 70% of it comes from the obsidian cliff. The second most common parts are from Bear Gulch over Idaho. But then you get Malad down here. And then you get Wild Horse Canyon obsidian showing up there. That's about 600 kilometers away. That's all the way almost to southwestern Utah. So this is the obsidian that's coming in there. And again, those pieces of the puzzle and asking questions and things about mobility. The obsidian that gets to the Absaroka Mountains can be getting there by people moving from point A to B to C to up there. You can get there by exchange, trade networks. marks. There's multiple ways to get there, but it indicates the connectedness of the remote areas, this wilderness area again, that we think of as being non-connected. It is widely connected throughout this area. And the obsidian source analysis lets you kind of document that and look at it. This just, I think graphically and image relatedly. So I started looking at my obsidian sources and said, well, how did the obsidian sources in the area relate to the migration corridors? And there's sort of some overlap there in terms of the distances. And yeah, you can end up down in Jackson Hole area, blah, 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 over here. There's the archaeology that I love doing tries to relate things or investigate things that aren't superficially or initially thought of as being related, like how obsidian moves across the landscape, and it's not moving across the landscape on its hooves, but it's moving across the on our hooves, or not. It's being moved across the landscape in interesting ways. So we can potentially look at the migration corridors and the obsidian movement to kind of link wildlife biology to this archaeology stuff. And again, getting back to a question that people always ask me as an archaeologist about the most exciting things I've ever found. I showed you the big database. Yeah, that's the top of the list. But here's an example of something that right now gets me jump up and down excited. And this is something that I found on Saturday, 16th of July, 2022 at 12:02 p.m. I know that because I marked its location on the GPS. Oh, where's the? Well, okay, there's only one right there, but I looked around and there was another one. And there was another one. I went back to camp that night. I was off by myself. I can't do that tedious recording all day long on archaeological sites. So I get the team set up and doing that. And then I take off and go out and do the fun stuff, find things like this. I got back to camp that night and I had these very images on my phone. I started showing to the team and look at this. And they said, each other, I think he's over the edge adult. He's got a rusted tin can that he wants us to be excited about. So a while later, we went back to that same place and did the full documentation. Found this obsidian projectile point, yeah, Lake prehistoric, and a metal projectile point you see on the right. And what's fun about that is after the fires, we've been finding sites where you see metal projectile points and how they're made. And when I'd seen those 3 bits of trash on the left, I knew that what they really were the little pieces that come off when you're taking a chisel and turning a piece of metal into an arrow point. And so we now know, once you find these little ugly bits, you may well be finding a site where arrow points were being made out of a new raw material, metal. And there's a whole series of fun things about that. One is that I'd always thought of metal points as being trade optics. That's what you're taught about, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, there's trade metal points, but the indigenous people realized really quickly that metal is a raw material that you can take and use yourself. You need a chisel and you can make points anywhere you want it. And they just plugged the metal into their technological system. It wasn't something, oh, here's the new stuff, we'll do something new with it. It just fit right in, which was a really fun way of looking at it. And another point that I'll always make about everything is if you record the exact location of all these little things, you see some fun stuff. I don't know if on this slide you can see it. All the little blue flags are metal bits. These are stone tool bits. But what appears to be going on here, if you get out magnifying glass and look here, they're using this rock here as the anvil for making the metal arrow points. And so you've got the little debris around there. If you map all the little debris, you can see that activity structure going on. You can get the picture of what was happening. So this to me is really exciting about the technology of this really brief time period where the new raw materials and all the stuff was coming in to the people living in that area. I mentioned fires. In 2006, we had to leave our field camp early for, I forget what it was about. We left this field camp the next day. The day after that, the Forest Service crew who was up there working on the fire got burned over by the Little Venus fire. I think it burned over them 3 or 5 times. They were in their shake and bake bags and made it through it. But that cut that field season short. But as soon as it could open up and go back in, I wanted to see what it had done to our archaeological records. So I went back into areas we'd inventoried before, spent some time looking around, and my jaw dropped. It's how much I was seeing in areas that we'd worked at and we'd crawled across and we'd examined, and then all of a sudden it's a whole new world. And here's an example of what a post-fire area looks like, rather than a place that, is covered with grass and you can't see the ground. All of a sudden the visibility opens up tremendously. And you know what? If you can see things, you can record things. More things started to show up, like glass beads. I still remember the day. I don't remember the date exactly, but September 2006, when one of these people asked, Dr. Todd, would you be interested in any beads? We'd never seen any of these glass trade beads up in that area for the first few years. And then all of a sudden, here's a few glass trade beads. And then you look over there, then you look over here, no, right here, you get a metal bracelet. Again, not a trade bead metal bracelet, but a piece of metal made into something that fit into the indigenous person's personal adornment. So this is just, again, got to have a histogram every other slide. This is the number of glass beads we've been finding in this project. None before the fire in 2006, and post-fire type stuff. Mm. We've got, 1,800 beads from the project now. Again, really fun stuff if you're thinking about wilderness and remote areas of Wyoming. We've got glass beads in the wilderness areas in the Absarokas, some of which come from the English and French traders on the East Coast, some of which come from the Russian traders on the Northwest Coast that are ending up in central Wyoming. Again, it's not connected, is it? It's in the middle of nowhere. Who's going to be? There were continental-wide trade networks that were making this not a remote, non-connected area, but plugged deeply into it. And that's, growing up in Meeteetse, I thought it was the back of nowhere. But, real obviously, it's richly connected with the larger socioeconomic systems. This is just an overview, again, one of those looking down on the site. Glass beads scattered over metal arrow point manufacturing, ceramics. This is another site where after the fire, it exposed enough bone that we can say, I think there's 14 bison here. Normally, when you think about going to the mountains to be hunting, you don't think about hunting bison at the higher elevation, but our archaeological sites are showing that they were a very common species up there. Oh, and one of my students who did his master's thesis on the fire history of this site, doing the tree coring and looking at fires burn through there, developed a model, a hypothesis that there's a relationship between fire history and bison abundance in the mountains. About 5 to 10 years after a fire burns through and it becomes more vegetated rather than timber, the bison populations start peaking. So there's probably relationships between campsite locations and whether bison are used or bighorn sheep are used or all those sorts of things. So we record all that so we can get the picture of the site. And again, people spend lots of time recording lots of little bits of stuff. The metal objects, again, from this site, lots and lots of fun things. Lots of the metal arrow being manufactured right there. Again, they're making those points on the site. And for some reason, I think maybe they're so easy to make that a lot of them just get lost during the manufacture. We find a lot of nearly complete points in all these scattered other bits. If you think about chipping, I've started doing some making metal points with chisels myself. You can make a metal point like that in under 5 minutes. You can make one quicker than you can make a stone point by far. So you're not investing a lot of time in it. And so you maybe lose some. Lots of stuff. And like everything else, once we have those metal points, we measure the hell out of them and put those in other places. One of the problems with studying this time period when trade items are coming in is we won't get deeply into the radiocarbon methods and issues and stuff like that. But the last several hundred years, the radiocarbon uses carbon-14 in the atmosphere that ends up in plants, then ends in animal bones, stuff like that, to tell how long it's been since whatever it incorporated it into its system died. But the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere fluctuates. It's not constant through time. So it's the curve and how it goes about it isn't just a straightforward line. The last couple hundred years of the radiocarbon dating thing is really tough to deal with. So on this site, for example, we got radiocarbon dates that tell us we've got glass trade beads there, we've got metal points. The radiocarbon dates tell us that that site was occupied sometime between the mid 1600s and the 1900s. Wow, that was worth that $300, wasn't it? So in dating sites like this, radiocarbon says, yeah, it's in that time period, but it's not the most effective. Another way to date these sites is to look at the diameter of the beads. Bead diameter changed through time. They got smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you measure the diameter on lots of beads and run them through an equation, you can start getting an idea of the age of the site. A lot better than radiocarbon dating, because it doesn't have that. We can say that the site is, this hearth here, these blue beads here, probably date to around 1800, more or less, which makes sense for when beads would be entered into that area. Lots of beads. You can look at differences in ages, different sites across it. These are maybe different family groups. Oh, here's a fun thing. If you look at these groups with different beads in them, and then you look at these are just all beads, not the different types. But if you look at the obsidian sources in those different things, there's different suites of obsidian around some of those different hearths, which suggests to me you may be seeing different family groups that have been moving at different parts across the landscape, ending up in this group and being together for a while. And then group A is going to see you later on going to South Fork, and group B is going to see non going to Jackson Hole. We'll see you next winter type thing. You see some differences. And that's one of the reasons we really need the locations of everything on an archaeological site, to being able to get these sort of hypotheses, these potential what's going on there. If you were just to come in with a handful of beads from the site and say, look at all these great artifacts I found, without having them individually spatially distributed and being able to associate it with the mapped obsidian, you wouldn't be able to do this if you just had the artifacts without their spatial association. And that's again why we like to leave it there. We like to leave all those basic data in their primary context, so it's available for the future. I love this whiteboard. So we look at, beads, round hearts, blah, 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 blah. Beads are different colors. And we also take broken beads that we've mapped separately and put back together. Just because why not? We'll show you why not in a minute, why you put things back together. This bead over here on the right, this has become my favorite bead of any we find. It's better than the Russian variegated beads and all this and that, the other. This is one of the terms for it is a white heart bead. And these didn't start being made until 1836. Which means they probably didn't start getting into the mountains of northwestern Wyoming. I put about an 1840 limit on it. It takes a while to get there. So these become a great time marker to find. And once you do that, you can start playing some other maybe games. What if we look at a site that has none of these white heart beads on it? What do the metal points look like on there? They look like this. What if you look at the sites that have more of the white heart beads on them? They look like this and they look like this. We may be able to use the bead technology to date the sites in a way well enough that we can start understanding the development of the metal point styles that we see across the site, where we can use something, and this is just maybe sample size of crap here. We can use this maybe to suggest that if you find metal points like this, they may be older than metal points that look like that. So take a time period that's really interesting to what's going on here with the peopling and be able to segregate it a bit in time, not just have, well, it was like prehistoric, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so putting the pieces together, I'm gonna, I've talked mostly about our surface work in the Absarokas today. But for the last 2 years, some colleagues and I have been spending time working at some excavation data that we collected in the mid-1980s from the Sunlight Basin of Wyoming, where we did some excavation up in the mountains of the area. And at that time, the site we excavated was sort of all by itself. There wasn't anything to compare it to. So one of the things I'm trying to do now is start taking all these big surface patterns where we've got this sort of coarse grain thing and look at the fine grain view we can get from excavations to not separate the surface data from the excavation data, but we've been going through our excavation data and coding all those things exactly the same way we do our surface data. So they go into the same data set. We can compare surface archaeology to the excavation archaeology. And I want to show you in terms of this pieces of a puzzle and putting them together, some of the stuff we can do with a site where we have high resolution mapping of all these little pieces. This is a site called Bugis Holding Sunlight Basin. It's got like 14 mountain sheep, 15 bison. It dates to 1659, and we can talk about how we can get a radiocarbon date that precise after I told you what a mess it was, but it's pre-contact or before much of the stuff started ending up here. We spent a lot of time mapping every single fragment. So what you see here is just these two squares of this site here. Each one of these is a fire hearth, a dump area. Each little dot is a piece of bone, a piece of chipstone, one of the things that's been mapped in place that gives you a picture of it. Once you map things in place, again, giving that puzzle thing, you can start putting them back together. What if you have a bison radius ulna that's been broken and part of it's here, lower end of it's here, and the upper end of it's down at that hearth there? What if you've got a bison cranium that part of it is right here and part of it's over here? By having everything mapped in place and doing stuff like that, you can start seeing the connectedness across the site. You can start seeing the dynamics of some parts, what's going on there. Rather than having just that snapshot of the past, if you just have that map, lots of stuff scattered around, you can start almost getting the dynamics of interconnection and movement. And so you see the bison connections on the right, the bighorn sheep on the left, sheep on the right. You can tell the difference between bison and sheep by the diagram. Fun things here. The seasonality of the sheep, you know, from looking at the tooth eruption where was about October. They were probably killed in a big communal kill, run into a sheep drive trap. Key parts brought back down into the valley, put into storage through the winter. So this is eating stuff out of stores. The bison, on the other hand, were killed all winter long. We know that because since we mapped everything in place and collected every little bit, we can look at the fetal bison bone development from very tiny fetuses to almost calving age fetuses. The bison were being killed all winter long. So what we may be seeing is you're a family group that has some food storage from the mountain sheep that you killed during the fall. You eat your sheep among the family. But if you're out hunting, one of the things hunters and gatherers often do is share things, come into it. You're out hunting, you kill some bison, you bring it back to camp, it gets shared across the group. You get that movement across it. So, one of the things we're trying to do with our Absaroka pattern is think about this as just the micro scale and just expand that up, looking connections between places and trying to understand how point A and point B and all these things go together. But the key to it is having precise locational information as possible to stop to tie artifacts and places together. Oh, this is that, I mentioned some of the other sites. Here's the differences in if these are different family groups. And we found this after we'd already made that family group model up. There's different suites of obsidian around these different parts again. So that might be a pattern that we need to recognize more. So what's often been done in the past when you send off obsidian to be sourced, you send off a couple pieces from a site and say, there's where the obsidian came from. Right now, we've got 100 pieces sourced from this site, and we're going to expand it a bunch. You need to not just know where the obsidian came from on the landscape, but it makes a lot of sense to know where it came from on the site compared to other sorts of things. So putting the pieces together. Oh, and there's again, to refresh your mind. So we've got some of the sites here from some of the stuff from Bear Gulch. Up here in Sunlight Basin, we've got some of the stuff from Lod, Obsidian Cliff, Teton Pass. So that's sort of an overview of part of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think to end up before, if there's questions or comments, I mentioned the things that people ask archaeologists, and after a talk like this, you often get asked, well, what does it all mean and how does it put together? And my favorite answer as a teacher has always been, I don't know. That's what I want to find out. That's for us. That's the question. So I'm more excited about saying I don't know than to give you this. We don't know. We're getting some hints. But first of all, wilderness archaeology is much more complex than we ever would have believed. It's connected more widely. It's richer. As Scott mentioned when he introduced me, I've done work in Africa and Southeast Asia and Europe and lots of places. I think some of the most spectacular archaeology I've ever seen is the archaeology up here, in part because when we started up there, it was this blank spot on the map. It was we don't know anything about it. So for somebody that's lazy like myself, if you want to be able to learn something, the best place to learn something is to go where you don't know anything. And so we've been learning a lot up here, but it's still, we need those 95 years more to get to our 5% sample before I go beyond. And the answer to the questions here, I don't know. So. Any questions or comments or suggestions or bad puns or? Yeah.
What was the red stone with the white, the bead?
That's the what's called a white hard bead. It was made in Venice, and it's got some white glass with the red glass around it. So to make beads like that, you blow it into a tube and pull the tube way out, then you break it into little segments, and then you round them off.
Okay, so it wasn't a ruby or a garnet or
No,
anything?
it was glass.
Okay.
Boy, if it was ruby, we'd be doing a lot more. No, we wouldn't. We'd try it. A ruby would fall into that high risk category that we would probably map its location, bring it out because.
Be lost.
Yeah.
So how do you source beads? I mean, it's probably obvious, but like Russian beads versus Venice versus.
A lot of, they're great question. There's multiple ways to do that. Some of it is the morphology. Some of the Russian beads are faceted. They're made differently than just the round seed beads or phony beads or things like that. But just like we talked about the obsidian sourcing, the sort of the better way to do it is to look at the micro elemental composition of the beads. So we have collected quite a few of the beads so we can have that done, because you can source, not only can you tell where they came from, you can tell where they were made from or when they were made by the chemical sourcing, because you may be able to say they came from Venice. A lot of our beads from, the East Coast trade were made in Venice. But the people who made beads in Venice plugged into the local, or not the local, the surrounding source economy, where there were lots of tariffs and where there weren't, depended upon where you got the raw materials for your beads to put into it. So from year to year, the specific composition of some of those beads may change, even though they look the same. So we haven't done the geochemical or the geochemical sourcing on the beads yet, but that's on the big list of need to get done. You can, like I say, get the general thing from the morphology, the shape, and the structure, but to dive into that great deeper question of where and when they came from, you need to do the chemistry. And there again, when I was an undergraduate student, one of the reasons I went into archaeology is I didn't want to do that chemistry stuff or that DNA stuff or that stuff like that. I found out now that in reality, to do good archaeology, you have to do all of those sorts of things. And you don't have to be an expert in it, but you need to know it well enough where you can talk to the people that are. And although the history of archaeology has been kind of fun in terms of stuff like that, in the 1950s, archaeologists started doing what we called multidisciplinary archaeology, where you go into the field and you take a botanist with you and you take a vertebrate paleontologist with you and you take somebody else with you. You don't go out and you do your same things. You write a report, each person would write a chapter. That was multidisciplinary archaeology. And then we realized that doesn't really get us very far. We need to do interdisciplinary archaeology where the research of those different things are interconnected, where the botanist and the biologist and the chemist and the archaeologist are all working together on the same chapter, the same question. They're integrated. And for the last several decades, we've been trying to push a little beyond that into what we called, and I probably shouldn't say this, transdisciplinary archaeology. To do away with the disciplinary boundaries altogether and have people work on the research questions, each bringing different parts of it in, not going to the field saying, I'm the archaeologist, I'm the botanist. We're here, we're trying to understand the dynamics of this landscape, regardless of what we've had our degree in. So we've really pushed that a little more than the past. Yeah.
Larry, recently I was looking at some photos of the Horner site out of Cody. And there was, I don't know how far it was, 3 or 4 feet of excavation.
But
You can see. And when we were at the site, you could not, it was all level. I'm just curious, did you fill those in or
well,
did we not look at that part?
no, the Horner site terrace that drops down the Shawnee River. The terrace surface at about 10,000 years ago was about like that. And where Princeton, and this will get into depth, people who don't know the Horner site probably don't give a shit about. Where Princeton and Smithsonian dug in the 1950s was only about that far below the surface. Where we dug at the University of Wyoming was about a meter below the surface. We filled it all back in. Yeah, in part because if you look at those pictures, there's bone. Even the extent of the bone didn't indicate excavation. So just like everything else we've talked about, if you've dug a hole in the ground that's exposing stuff, you fill it back in so it's preserved and there for the next folks that want to come back and look at it. Yeah.
What was some of the, I saw that a lot of the stuff you were finding was more, recent archaeology or, what was kind of the age range?
Oh, we've got everything from Clovis at 13,000 years ago up to Glass Trade Beach. We've got everything.
That's cool.
And yeah, we could, that's one of the things, when I showed you, I showed you those areas of stuff. We could do those same things with the ages of the projectile points on each one of those and show you. And I can do the elevations of where we find, I've got a slide of that somewhere, where if you have elevation on this axis with this lower and this higher, and time period on this axis with the old stuff here, the 13,000, 10,000 years, the 200 years here, these are fairly high. And then they drop and drop and drop and they drop in terms of average elevation that you found points. And part of this may be by the time you get to that contact period, they're using horses as well. And you need the grazing area for the lots of the horses and the stuff like that. So the elevation that you use more often changes. So good question. And if we have this data set, it's real easy to find the real answers to it. So thank you. Yeah.
I know you spent a lot of time in Ethiopia and at a fairly, I'm gonna say, relatively recent time period versus 2.5 million years ago for humanoids. When you were there, did you find periods of time when there was the development of the weapons, when we think about spear points, atlatls, bows?
You tried to, we published an article in Nature last,
And
last
it can
fall.
be sold right down here for $25.95.
Last fall, where we argued that we found the earliest arrow points ever made at the SM1 site in Ethiopia at 74,000 years old. And we argued that there were arrow points for several reasons. One, if you measure the dimensions of them in terms of shaft and this and that, they fall within the range of modern arrow points. B, if you look at the use wear modifications on it, they were definitely hafted and then being used for penetrating. And C, I forgot where I am, there's impact fractures on it, where they hit things at a high velocity that seems to be at a velocity more like an arrow point than a thrown point. So we may have found the earliest arrow points anywhere in the world at one of our sites in Ethiopia. So that might have been something to say when you ask about exciting things, rather than the little rusted piece of metal.
Exciting.
But I still follow with the little rusted piece of metal. So
Yeah.
Did they use atlatls back then or there versus what we do here?
There's no evidence of it. There's a lot of atlatl use evidence in Europe during the Upper Paleolithic. And before that, they've been arguing that they're mostly thrusting spears and throwing spears. But a third thing about the points there that we argue that their arrow points, they're so uniform in their final sizes. You know, you don't have big ones and little ones, they all fall into the same weight. And, oh, God, I should have brought my bolo tie. We did 3D scanning of all those points. And then after we 3D scanned them, you can print them out. And one of my colleagues did a metal printout of one of the arrow points from SM1 in, I forget what kind of metal it was, mounted it on his arrow shaft, went hunting in Colorado last fall and killed his deer with it. So if that doesn't prove they were arrow points. And he also made us all bolo points to print out of that. So, yeah.
Follow up to that, you said argued. What was the other side of that argument? What was the suggestion as to what they were? If the counterpoint was these are the oldest arrow point potentially, what was the?
That they may have been atlatl points, they may have been thrusting spear points, that they may have been something else, but there's this whole suite of things that it's just, they're so much older than the other arrow points that they're at that end of the spectrum where it's hard to believe that they're out there that far, but but then again, where we're working, another fun connection between Ethiopia and North, there's a lot of them. The Ethiopian highlands are volcanic, about like the same age as the Absarokas. And where we were working in northwestern Ethiopia, everybody that works in Ethiopia works in the Rift Valley, east of the highlands. We went over the top of the highlands into the tributaries of the Blue Nile. And when we went there, nobody had done any work there. So there's one site there that we've done extensive excavations in that that area of the Blue Nile is about half the size of Wyoming. And so until we get more work done on there to see what the range of points in that time period look like, it's an open question. So it's like the 1.2% of the area we've looked at here. There's been 0.00074% of the lithic technologists from northwestern Ethiopia looked at. So right now, I think we can make an argument that these look like they meet all the criteria for arrow points, but they're kind of odd out there. Yeah.
What kind of material? Was it a chert or?
There's some cherts, there's some chalcedonies, there's plates chalcedonies that they, like you'd find in the Badlands. There's basalt, there's cherts, there's a variety of types. And again, they've taken 3 or 4 different raw material types and right down to exactly the same dimensions of length, width, thickness, things like that. Yeah.
I have a question looking at some of your maps. where you're finding isolated artifacts out in the middle of nowhere, not associated with those localities. Obviously, if you've got a tool or something, it might make sense for them out there, but I was wondering if you might personally have a theory as to why it is that we find the occasional secondary or tertiary flake out by itself in the middle of nowhere. And you can shovel test and look around and there won't be anything else, but there's this one flake that doesn't seem to fit with anything nearby.
Well, there's a whole series of reasons that usually I believe there's got to be something else there. I usually get down and crawl for hours if I find one flake. As we were talking at dinner, one of the things that we did years ago was spend a lot of time seeing how far, you talked about tertiary flakes, how far harvester ants can pack tertiary flakes. And we looked at the glass trade beads and stuff, and flakes up to 7 millimeters long can be transported by harvester ants. And in the experiments we did with the beads of how far they transport stuff, we found beads that we put out for ants to transport up to 200 meters away from where we put them. So you can have things like that move across a landscape. You can have, they can create isolates. I can envision a site, a beautiful site where you'd retouched a bunch of stone tools. There were several hundred flakes there with and a harvester ant or a pogo mound can be active for 15 to 20 years. And if you think of all those movements, they could completely disperse all those flakes from that area. So there's the question of that. That's part of one of the fun questions that would be really a kick to what is an isolate and how could it have got there? When I was trained to do archaeology, if it was just an isolated flake like that, you just ignored it because it was just an isolated flake. To take your question and go to a slightly different way, one of the things we've been finding along those migration corridors, especially along the migration movement corridors away from the good campsites, we find a lot, there's a high correlation between isolated projectile points and shell casings. So we map every shell casing when you're out there and map every isolated projectile point. Surprisingly enough, they end up in sort of the same places. So good question, fun stuff. Oh, if you were a student, I'd say, boy, that would be a great thesis topic.
There you go, Bill.
Yes,
There you go.
It's time, Bill.
I was gonna have you put all the cans, see if there's points.
So I would be what I call archaeologist adjacent, maybe. But I'm curious, I really appreciate your perspective of, sort of like the Boy Scout mentality of, leave no trace, but leave it as recorded, But I'm curious what you think about that in the context of the possibility that areas, particularly of Wyoming, that previously weren't going anywhere, that could potentially be sold to other hands, and how you feel that might impact the types of work that you do.
I know exactly where you're going, and that's one of the toughest things. Talking about a real tough moral dilemma there. The right place for those to be are there. But we know, we go back and revisit these sites, and we know that, like we showed you all the stuff after a fire. We'd recorded one site. 10 days later, I took the forest archaeologist up to show him the artifacts that we recorded, footprints all over it, artifacts gone. So yeah, they need to be there, but there needs to be a lot stronger enforcement of the laws to protect them. There's not. For the entire Shoshone wilderness, there was one backcountry law enforcement officer. So the stuff, that I was hinting at that, of those little puzzle pieces disappearing. So that's the dilemma. They should stay there. I want them to stay there. I'd like to hire some snipers to be sure they stay there. There's all these things that morally and ethically, how can you do?
You might have more projectiles to map later.
Again, there's going to be more cartridge casings associated with the highest density.
Instead of that one.
No, honestly, I'm making fun of this, but this is a really tough the indigenous people want us to leave those there. You know, the people have been erased from the landscape, and if you start erasing the physical presence of it, that just takes it one step further. As a scientist, I want to leave it there. You know, there's a good overlap there between indigenous expectations and scientific, but in the reality, it's at terrible risk. One of the things we've done that I get a kick out of, when we talk to kids groups, you know, we often do things with young school kids and stuff, and we talk about archaeology, and I bring them wanted posters of here's an artifact that was recorded September something and found missing, blah, 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 presumed stolen. And it's been fun how many times you get these sort of irritated calls from parents saying, my kid came home and told me I was out there stealing your artifact. But it's good. Yeah, I think, I don't know that's again a no, because of how many conflicting emotions and thoughts and wishes and anger and thanks. Yeah.
I'm just curious how the beads would get scattered everywhere. Weren't those kind of a precious item? I
Oh,
mean,
great question. I had a student who did his doctoral dissertation in South America, working with folks that still trade beads in these networks. And we came up here and showed him that stuff, and he said, oh, you're not going to find that many beads until you're at the end of the trade network potentials. If you get to a place where there's nobody down the line who doesn't have fewer beads than you do, they lose a lot of their commodity value. So that's part. He said if you drop one bead down there where he was working, they'd spend hours looking. These folks, these look like they were beads that were being worked like around the fire hearths and maybe doing some beading or being there in some of your bead spray. And at that point, they were just more decorative than having the commodity value. So they may have been lost. But so we made the point that the Absarokas may be connected, but they may be the end point of a lot of those trade routes. You know, you can't take the beads you've got from the French traders down to New Mexico and trade those beads with them for anything. They're going to say, look at what we've got.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so again, that's the speculation, but a potential. And again, that would be a really fun topic to follow up as a research thing. Yeah.
You know, it sounds like you did a very thorough survey of all that land. You ever run across any human remains or burials or anything?
Fortunately, no.
Yeah. You know, because there's a lot of people living in that
Yeah,
area.
there are a lot of people there, but you know, if they're doing some of the later traditional stuff of leaving the bodies up for scattering and the bones don't get buried, we could maybe find some teeth, we could maybe find some stuff, but we haven't as yet. So no.
In the wilderness or at elevation, have you done much excavating? I mean, is there just as much, maybe lower?
We've done some test excavations. And one of the things we've heard in the wilderness about the alpine zones, one of the things that archaeologists say is there's no deposition up there, so there's going to be no buried material. But once you learn the biogeological nature of those areas, you can find areas where there's a fair amount of deposition. For example, if you've got a sag pond, a little pond from one of the slumps that has moisture in it, and you've got lots of pocket gophers around it doing their pocket gopher thing, every year there's a fair amount of sediment washed into that, building it up. So pocket gophers can provide the sediment to do some testing. We've done one site, we tested the year 2006 when that fire burned through, where we were going to move to sites to do some excavations. We got down almost 1.5 meters in one of these pocket gopher sort of generated soil things in the sag pond, and got a radiocarbon date around 2,000 years. So yeah, there a lot of it is not deposited. There's some sites on the ridge tops especially, or some artifact distributions where you can find a 10,000-year-old point right next to a beer can. They're there together. Yeah.
Presumably these were mostly summer habitations.
Oh, great question. Like I showed you that Bucus holding site in the Sunlight Basin, definitely a winter because of the fetal bison development that was all winter long. We haven't done enough excavation at the higher elevations yet to get a lot of that, but we've got one site at 2,900 meters that we've got one or two fetal mountain sheep in April or March, which is not, yet summer. I think that's, again, we've got this notion that you go on the mountains fall hunting or summer picnicking and stay out of there in the winter. Bucus Holding at the Sunlight Basin was a great place because there's a lot of, the bison were there during the winter. You could kill the sheep in the mountains next to it, and then you got firewood and open water. It was probably, you don't want, why in the world would you pack all that food out of the mountains, you would have expended enough energy on that you're not gonna make it. So I think that I think the closer we look at those higher elevation sites, the more we're going to see that indicates longer seasonality. The other thing that often plays into it is we think of them as being probably just male hunters up there in the mountains. A lot of these sites look like entire family groups, the beads and all this other stuff. There's entire families up there, not just the special task groups going up into the areas.
One final question for Myron. Turn your hand down.
So we recently tragically had a really large fire come through this area. And I'd be curious your thoughts. I mean, to my knowledge, and someone's going to come for me in a second here, I'm sure, there has not been in our backyard, so to speak, the amount of longitudinal study that you've done in this area. I'd be curious what your expectations might be, not to extrapolate data points, from this exactly, just to, copy paste onto it. But if something like this were to be done in this area after a fire recently that just came through like ours, what you might expect to find? Do you expect that there would be a lot more
I would
artifacts?
expect, given the, the raw material availability in the bighorns and the other sorts of, the caves and the rock shelters and all this, yeah, I'd say so. But one of the problems you have with doing post-fire archaeology in the wilderness, especially, is after a forest fire burns through, there used to be, and I don't know if there still is, something called the burned area emergency bear responses. And to get bear responses to do archaeology, you can only have the money if you can go to a site that's already been recorded and known to be significant. The wilderness has no sites recorded, so there's no, we eventually did get bear money by doing 3 fires with no funding and going in and doing the post-fire stuff and creating probability maps that showed that we could predict fairly highly where archaeological materials, don't use that damn site word, where archaeological materials are going to be in the areas that are burned. And for a while there, we had some people in the Denver office that bought into that. So we did get funding for 1 fire to go in, and we found spectacular stuff.
Well, let's thank Larry.
Maybe.